The evolution of witches in film and TV. Although they're most synonymous with the Halloween season, witches have permeated American pop culture to the point that they're as common an archetype as superheroes or Santa Claus. When someone mentions witches, your first thought may be of an elderly woman cackling over a bubbling cauldron. But if you examine the characters' depictions in media over the last 100 years, you'll notice a huge variety when it comes to the archetype, with portrayals of witches ranging from sexy seductresses to accused women to rebellious outsiders. At certain points in time, witches were used as a way to chastise female behavior that was deemed inappropriate, while in other instances they were symbols for women's empowerment and sexual liberation. In today's video, we'll be taking a look at the evolution of the witch archetype in American TV and film, and how depictions of the character were heavily influenced by cultural, economical, and societal factors. Let's get into it. Witches first made appearances in American media during the silent film era in the early 1900s. They were often presented as fantastical characters, where their one contribution to the story was to provide a gift, curse, or prophecy unto the protagonist. Alternatively, during this time period, there were historically inspired retellings of witch trials, where an outcasted woman would be accused of witchcraft. In these stories, the woman's supposed crime would typically be fending off the advances of a man, who in turn would lash out in anger by accusing her of being a witch who had tempted him to sin. Failing to prove her innocence on her own, she would either be killed or be rescued by another man who she would go on to wed, redeeming herself in the eyes of the townfolk. Symbolically, the accused witch of the silent film era was representative of how women had historically been blamed for the faults of men, who were willing to say or do anything to absolve themselves of responsibility. At the same time, the women's suffrage movement was gaining traction, demanding for the right to vote and equal education. This version of the witch spoke to an audience that was fighting against the patriarchy. With the rise of the Jazz Age, young women began to push back against societal norms, participating in activities that were once considered immoral or taboo. Up until that point, female characters had been depicted as domestic, religious, chaste, and obedient to men, and if they weren't, they were punished for it. With women seeing an increased amount of social, financial, and political independence, the witch and her moralistic message were no longer needed, and for a few years the witch archetype disappeared. As films began to incorporate sound in the 1920s, their storylines were able to evolve, and we saw a boom in morally and ethically ambiguous protagonists, known as anti-heroes. This era of Hollywood, known as pre-code Hollywood, was subject to regular controversy and scandal, with many films being deemed inappropriate or downright indecent. Compared to what we see today, you'd hardly consider these films risque, but to some audiences in the early 1900s, gunfights, kissing, and alcohol was seen as Hollywood tearing apart traditional values and promoting unsavory behavior. With these concerns threatening their financial success, studios began to implement self-censorship, with an official list of don'ts and be carefuls called the Motion Picture Production Code, also known as the Haze Code, being fully enforced in 1934. This set of rules and regulations had extremely Catholic overtones, insisting that these were necessary precautions in order to prevent supposed moral decline and promote traditional values. Some of the rules dictated by the Haze Code covered nudity, excessive kissing, ridicule of the clergy, cruelty to animals, and drug use. The primary goal of the Haze Code was to make it clear to audiences that being evil was wrong and being good was right. And as such, all criminal actions in films during the Haze Code era could not go unpunished, and villains had to have some form of comeuppance or repentance. Many of the regulations within the Haze Code directly contradicted the witch archetype, and depictions of the witch, who had been so tied to sexuality and anti-religion, had to be adjusted to better fit Hollywood's new rules. Besides being affected by the Haze Code, the Great Depression also had an impact on films in the 1930s. Audiences wanted an obvious villain that they could root against who would go on to receive just punishment. By removing any moral gray area, the audience had the chance to forget about the harsh realities that they were struggling with and see a world where the good guy actually won. This was perfectly represented by Disney's Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, released in 1937, which depicted the evil queen's magic as fantastical, with no ties to reality or religion. The queen, while beautiful, is undeniably wicked and therefore has to be punished. The punishment starts when she turns to magic and is transformed into an old hag. Not only does this take away her one redeemable quality, her beauty, but it allows the audience to further distance themselves from her emotionally, allowing her eventual death to be justifiable. The faults in her character are also used to improve the audience's perception of Snow White, who becomes the epitome of righteousness and goodness. The evil queen's characterization, first vain and beautiful, then vengeful and ugly, would influence the witch archetype for years to come. However, nothing had more of an impact on the perception of witches than 1939's Wizard of Oz.
I'll get you, my pretty, and your little dog, too!
With her green skin, which up until that point had never been associated with witches, pointed hat, flying broomstick, and black dress, the Wicked Witch of the West has become the point of reference for all witches. Unlike prior iterations of the witch where the character's morality was dependent on the audience's perception and her role within the story, witches in The Wizard of Oz were clearly framed as either good or evil. The influence of the Haze Code is obvious throughout the film, with only wicked witches being punished, either crushed by a house or melted into a puddle. Even when it comes to their appearance, it's obvious who you should be rooting for.
I've never heard of a beautiful witch before. Only bad witches are ugly.
The Wicked Witch's green skin makes her look sickly and inhuman, while her wardrobe with its Edwardian influences no doubt reminded contemporary audiences of their grumpy elders. Meanwhile, Glinda the Good Witch in her pink poofy gown looks like cotton candy, and her sweetness allows her to be loved by all who know her. Because the films were prohibited from anti-Catholic sentiments, witches during this time period were purposely fantastical and mythical. They no longer had any relation to the accused women of Salem who made deals with the devil and flaunted traditional values. With the arrival of World War II at the end of the decade, Hollywood changed entirely, with a focus on producing films that played to American nationalism and encouraged hope, a form of wartime propaganda that is still employed today. As such, the rare films that featured witches would present the character as an easily identifiable enemy, someone who disrupted the peace and quiet of a tranquil town, turning things upside down with her magic and unconventional behavior. These wartime witches were strangers, outsiders, a threat to everything good old-fashioned Americans held dear. And unlike her earlier counterparts during the silent film era, witches in the 1940s were deliberately and purposefully sexual, a direct threat to the sanctity of marriage and suburban life, with the tables turning so men were now the ones rejecting flirtatious advances. This version of the witch would often be tied to her Salem ancestry in one way or another, allowing us to see how far she's come since the days where men had all the power and she was just another crazy woman. With the 1950s bringing on the widespread popularization of trick-or-treating, something that had fallen by the wayside during the war as a result of sugar rationing, the media decided to profit off of consumer interest and deliberately created film and television characters that would inspire Halloween costumes. The strength of the Halloween dollar resulted in numerous appearances of the animated witch, a nonsensical character that boiled the witch down to a few basic tropes. It was also around this time that 1939's Wizard of Oz finally turned a profit, airing on TV regularly and becoming an undeniable classic. The Wicked Witch's appearance greatly impacted the look of animated witches, who similarly wore pointed hats, had colored skin, and rode broomsticks. Although those characters may not have made a lasting impression, their appearance did, and the witch became a go-to Halloween costume. Although technological progress had been halted because of the war, by the 1960s the amount of televisions in American homes were in the millions, and in order to profit off of this newfound medium, Hollywood adapted, focusing on producing short-form content that could be easily and cheaply made. Because watching TV was considered a family activity, the witch in turn was made more accessible and family-friendly, with the character sharing some qualities with past depictions but becoming far more comedic. There was Morticia Addams, who between 1964 and 1966 played into the trope of the seductive witch while simultaneously satirizing nuclear family dynamics. There was also Bewitched, which aired from 1964 to 1972, which focused on Samantha Stevens, a witch who had married a mortal. Aside from her magical abilities, Samantha's struggles were things the average suburban housewife could easily relate to. like overbearing parents, nosy neighbors, and marriage squabbles. A similar relatability was used for the character of Sabrina Spellman in her own animated show, where she dealt with the everyday struggles of being an average teen who just so happened to have magical powers. The characterization of these witches on TV were heavily influenced by the rise of second-wave feminism, which critiqued patriarchal cultural practices and focused on women's reproductive rights, rights in the workplace, sexuality, and legal inequalities. As such, these witches would often deal with real struggles that women faced both at home and out in the world, like harassment, discrimination, and lack of appreciation, all under the guise of being a family-friendly sitcom. Modern-day critics are split on whether or not these depictions of witches are actually feminist or sexist. On one hand, these witches are powerful and able to solve their own problems, but on the other hand, they choose to obey traditional gender roles as a housewife or a mother. However, if we look at Bewitched closely, we can see how Samantha's storyline directly correlates to issues occurring during the time period, even those of sexual harassment or racism. Her character in its entirety could be seen as a commentary on bodily autonomy, that despite her husband's demands that she act human, she spites him and continues to use her magic as she pleases, subverting expectations of the time that men are the ultimate authority. By the 1960s, the Haze Code was on its way out, and many of the rules that affected the witch archetype were no longer applicable, so instead of being the villain or the victim, she could be morally ambiguous once again. As a result, witches in film were often wild and sexually liberated, the antithesis of their domesticated TV counterparts. These witches would prosper in an environment where female sexuality was feared, and the witch's actions would often lead to the undoing of a mortal man, which she would have little to no remorse over. This version of the witch could be seen as a critique on the new direction of feminism and gender roles, with her beauty and femininity being both a gift and a curse. During the 1970s, counterculture movements were growing in popularity, racial tensions were high, war protests were ongoing, and teenagers were gaining more independence. A product of its environment, the horror genre underwent a massive upheaval and revival, with up-and-coming directors breathing a new life into the industry, which eventually led to the slasher genre. The film industry as a whole saw a huge increase in graphic content, in regard to both sexuality and violence. And combined with the mainstream popularization of the occult, Hollywood took note and witches in film soon began to reference authentic practices. Prior to this point, traditional aspects of witchcraft were hardly depicted in American media, resulting in public perception of it either being seen as the work of the devil and inherently evil, or completely fictitious and fantastical. This meant that the public could be easily swayed one way or another. As a result, when Rosemary's Baby was released in 1968, which featured characters openly participating in Satanism, it was easy for audiences to confuse the two and buy into the idea that witchcraft was evil. Unlike witch-centric movies of the past, which had elements of fantasy and fiction, Rosemary's Baby was presented as reality, implying that darkness could be lurking behind any corner. The success of the film, and the rise of interest in the occult that coincided with it, set witches on the path to become staples of the horror genre. Unlike past eras where the witch could be found in comedies, dramas, or thrillers, the witch in the 1970s was almost exclusively present in horror films. Magic would be a crucial part of these stories, and the witches in them would often be depicted in a negative light. While witches of the 60s had control over their sexuality and used men as they saw fit, something that coincided with the start of the sexual revolution, witches in the 1970s and 80s were filmed through the male gaze, with gratuitous nudity and sexual acts becoming as much a part of their character as magic. This resulted in films that were less about sexual liberation and more about objectification and exploitation. One rare exception to the rule is 1976's Carrie, a subversive coming-of-age story that detailed the complex relationship between femininity, religion, and sexuality. Abused by everyone around her, we pity Carrie and can understand the reasoning behind her actions, but we're equally terrified of what she's capable of. In this film, the witch is metaphoric of the struggles women face living in a patriarchal society, and how women continue to be demonized for simply existing. As previously mentioned, this era was filled with racial tension, with many marginalized groups demanding change. As a result of these open conversations about oppression, we finally began to see the appearance of black witches, most notably in the 1978 all-black musical, The Wiz. Prior to this point, women of color, especially black women, had been excluded from narratives revolving around witchcraft or magic. Rare exceptions resulted in storylines where they were othered, only able to practice voodoo or other supposedly savage forms of magic. The lack of witches of color reflected a growing problem that many had with first and second wave feminism, which focused on issues that white women faced and refused to address the forms of oppression that were faced by women who lacked those privileges. Case in point, although the women's suffrage movement granted women the right to vote, Black, Indigenous, and Asian women would not be able to until decades later. As such, the Wiz's depiction of black witches was revolutionary, but unfortunately, it didn't result in much change. Although occult practices had risen in popularity and interest since the 1950s, they were still fairly misunderstood by the general public. And with so many movies during the 1970s depicting witchcraft as evil, many people began to genuinely believe that it revolved around human sacrifice, demonic possession, and physical abuse.
What does it mean to be a witch?
Well, as a believer in the material world and a psychiatrist to boot, I'm convinced that the current spread of belief in magic and the occult is part of mental illness.
This eventually culminated in Satanic Panic in the mid-1980s, a conspiracy that claimed there were thousands of cases of ritual abuse happening across the country, and as a result, witches became the new boogeyman. Witch films were temporarily put on hold as they were deemed too risky for the current social climate, and when they were finally placed back into production during the later half of the decade, witches were framed in a way that wouldn't alienate their now scared of the occult audience. Satanic Panic's impact on the archetype was impossible to ignore. With films leaning into the idea that the occult was something to be feared, magic was corruptible, and witchcraft should be punished. Witches from this time period were either evil, hunting down children or sleeping with the devil, or fragile, and thereby more susceptible to being led astray by no fault of their own. Satanic Panic also influenced historical stories of the accused witch, which were now redirected to focus on mass hysteria, paranoia, and conspiracies, as opposed to previous iterations that highlighted the relationship between the accused witch and those around her. When Satanic Panic finally died down in the mid-90s, with media coverage now criticizing the phenomenon, a full-blown witch craze began. As if to combat the negative perception of the archetype that had reigned over the 80s, we saw a return to family-friendly witch media, with Hollywood even going as far as to remake content they'd originally released in decades past. Sabrina Spellman made a return, first in a movie, then a live-action TV series, then again in an updated animated format. Similar to the show from the 1960s, the point of the live-action series was to relate to teens and tweens while using magic as comedy. 1998's Casper Meets Wendy, which starred a very young Hilary Duff, did something similar by reintroducing the good little witch who had first appeared on the new Casper cartoon show back in 1963. By focusing on nostalgia, the return of this type of witch helped ease some of the lingering anxieties people had about witchcraft and magic, and it became harmless, making it acceptable for young audiences. This reacceptance allowed for the eventual creation of other kid-focused witch media, like Halloween Town in 1998, Twitches in 2005, and Wizards of Waverly Place in 2007. It'd be impossible to talk about the kid-friendly witch rebranding without mentioning Harry Potter. The first installment of the book series was released in 1997 and found worldwide success, spawning an eventual film franchise that started in 2001. The series, which followed the exploits of a young wizard and his friends at school, was popular with adults and kids alike. But it wasn't without controversy, and in America there were calls to ban the books from schools, with religious extremists stating that it was sacrilege and promoted Satanism. However, the continued success of the series was just more proof that negative perception about witches and witchcraft were beginning to wane. In a post-Satanic Panic era, witches were often depicted as outcasts or misfits, reflecting the effect widespread paranoia had on actual people of the time period. In 1996's The Craft, a group of girls are treated with disdain by other students at school, which eventually leads them to turn to magic in the hopes of bettering their circumstances. In the film, magic is presented as neither good or evil. Instead, it's up to the witch herself to decide the direction she wishes to go, allowing everyone the opportunity to redeem themselves if they so desire, adding a sense of humanity that past interpretations of the witch lacked. The Craft was well received by the youth, who saw it as an authentic depiction of the struggles of adolescence and coincided with the generation's rebelliousness. In a way, the film perfectly exemplified sentiments that were presented in third-wave feminism, which pushed for sexual liberation and intersectionality. As such, The Craft is also important as it marked the return of the Black witch in cinema, and many credit the character of Rochelle for opening doors for other women of color in the fantasy and supernatural genre. Although witches had always been depicted as outcasts during the wartime era of the 1940s especially, 1998's practical magic sought to right that wrong, and by the end of the film, the Owen sisters have not only made peace with their ancestry and magical abilities, but have also been fully accepted by the townsfolk who embrace magic in order to help them. This reflected the feminist idea of the time that women should band together and support one another, that we're stronger in numbers. This idea of sisterhood and friendship was similarly present in The Craft and Witches of Eastwick, allowing the audience to see that witchcraft and magic were not only to cause harm, but to provide protection as well. During this time period, there was a rise in horror films, slashers like Scream or I Know What You Did Last Summer, or torture porn like Saw or Hostel. But because they had no reason to be chopping people up, witches were rarely present. However, there was one notable exception. In 1999, the Blair Witch Project was released, and it was a full-blown cultural phenomenon. Although she never actually appeared on screen, audiences were manipulated into creating their own idea of the Blair Witch based off of decades worth of misconceptions and stereotypes about witchcraft. Its at the time revolutionary found footage style led many to think the film was real, and the Blair Witch would go on to become an urban legend alongside the Bunnyman, Bloody Mary, and Slenderman. The idea of a vengeful witch would wind up setting the course for the character for the remainder of the decade. With the TV industry refocusing its energy towards teens and young adults, changes had to be made to the witch formula. As a result, there was a switch from sitcoms to supernatural dramas, and witches now had to be enviable, not just relatable. With characters like Willow Rosenberg and Phoebe Halliwell, the witch found herself a permanent place in pop culture as a fashion icon. While in the past there had been both beautiful and ugly witches, in the modern era they were all gorgeous. Although that may seem like a step in the wrong direction, this allowed witches to further themselves from the negative association they developed as seductresses or temptresses. The idea behind these shows was that women could use their sexuality if they wanted to, but they didn't have to because they were powerful in other ways. This version of the witch also came about during the rise of the girl power movement, the idea that women should be vocal about their independence and confidence. Buffy the Vampire Slayer and Charmed played into the idea of girl power, and the women became a symbol for female empowerment, touting the message that women were capable of anything they put their minds to and that men were the weak link. At a certain point, the girl power message eventually became synonymous with badass, and many supernatural women, not just witches, became action stars.
That is for ruining my favorite movie, and oh yeah, my life too.
I personally saw this as regressive. By reducing the importance of magical power in favor of combat, it felt like Hollywood was unintentionally diminishing the strength of femininity. When witches made a widespread return to the silver screen in the mid-2000s, they were vastly different from their girl power counterparts. Now a spirit, the witch would swear vengeance on those who had betrayed her in life, equal parts victim and villain. The circumstances of her betrayal, or her relationship to magic, was unimportant. Instead, these witches only cared about retribution. We could empathize with this version of the witch, in spite of her murderous rage. And she was the perfect evolution of the accused witch trope. She had once struggled for justice, now she had the power to enact it herself. Tween-focused shows and movies like Halloween Town, Twitches, and Wizards of Waverly Place had witches that were in a sense multicultural. No longer forced to choose one way of living or the other, which was a direct reflection of society moving towards cultural acceptance as opposed to assimilation. With many of these featuring witches of color, Hollywood realized there was clearly an audience looking for that sort of representation, and more non-white witches began to appear. In the past, where they would have been othered, made to practice a form of the occult that kept them in a box, they were now able to exist in a space that would have been previously kept from them. As we moved through the 2010s, depictions of witchcraft grew darker, not necessarily evil, but far more willing to kill. Although there were a few instances of original content, like American Horror Story Coven, which took the fashion-forward witch to the next level, we saw numerous remakes and reboots of past witch content that attempted to comment on contemporary issues like homophobia, racism, transphobia, and sexism. With witches regularly being coded as outsiders, it made sense to use them as a symbol for contemporary injustices and representative of marginalized groups. However, it often came off as pandering.
You girls ought to be careful in the woods at night. A lot of weirdos out here.
We are the weirdos, mister.
2018's Chilling Adventures of Sabrina took the character of Sabrina Spellman and gave her a horror-driven storyline. In prior iterations, the character had been fairly normal, dealing with actual struggles teens of the 70s, 90s, and 2000s could relate to. Meanwhile, this new version of Sabrina is all-powerful, constantly fighting demons and stuck in numerous love triangles. It's the type of story no one could relate to. Other witch reboots like Charmed, The Craft Legacy, and The Witches fail for similar reasons. During the 2000s and 2010s, Hollywood was on the hunt for the next Harry Potter or Lord of the Rings, and as a result, many fantasy witches made their way into theaters. These witches would have no ties to actual witchcraft, instead resembling characters from fairy tales. In a way, this was a direct reaction to the depictions of witches on TV, who were far angstier and rooted in reality. This provided some of the widest range of witches we'd seen in quite some time. A recurring theme in the characterization of these fantasy witches was an obsession with beauty or immortality. If you recall, one of our earliest witches from Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs had similar motivations, and it's interesting to see how the trope was still going strong decades later. With many of the actresses starring in these roles being in their 50s or older, I saw this as Hollywood inadvertently revealing its ageism, and how in that world, once you've gotten a few wrinkles, you're essentially a crone.
She's 18 years old and her skin has never seen the sun, so of course it's good.
In a sea of boring witches come two excellent depictions. The first, The Witch in 2015, and the second, The Love Witch in 2016. Both are heavily inspired by witch films of the past and use witchcraft as a symbol for female empowerment. In The Witch, Thomasin is the stereotypical accused woman with her religious family blaming her for their problems, despite being the culprits themselves. As their situation worsens, she's accused of being a witch, and as a result she makes a deal with the devil. After she joins a coven, she finds herself free from the world that wishes to persecute her. Thomasin finds this sense of liberation by gaining independence from the antiquated views of her world that expect her to behave a certain way. Much like Carrie nearly 40 years before, the film highlights how young women are failed by the world around them. The Love Witch has a similar message, although presented in a different manner. Unlike the era it takes inspiration from, the female characters, although sexual, are not exploited or objectified. Although they're underestimated by the men around them, it's almost what they desire, as it allows them to continue living in the manner they wish to. When they turn to witchcraft, which is symbolic of their femininity, it's in order to survive in a patriarchal society. The film comments on both second and fourth wave feminism, asking the audience to question whether or not Elaine is progressive in her ideas about relationships or dated. As the witch has evolved, so have we. Whether they're bright green and riding a broomstick, karate chopping demons, or casting spells on their loved ones, it's clear that the witch can speak to women of any era. What are your thoughts on the evolution of witches? I hope you enjoyed this video. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and I'll see you soon. Bye!